Connecting. Perfect. There we go. All right. Get my thoughts in order. Here we go. J. Kim, welcome to the show, man. And Krista, I don't know if you listen to these, but Krista, also thank you. Krista has become one of my favorite people in the world. She helped set up quite a bit of these, but welcome to the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, we'll see. Thrilled is a big word, so we shall see. One, right? Yeah. So,
That's true. You're
yeah,
right.
yeah. I'm assuming you probably haven't listened to any of the past ones, right? Or maybe you have. Some people have, some people haven't.
I've listened to yeah. I've gone back and listened to little snippets, yeah, just to get
Okay,
a feel
okay. I just want to make sure
for
we
how it
we
goes.
we
So
level
yeah.
set with thrilled. I just want to make sure we level set. So,
No, man, I'm pumped to be here. I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
perfect. So I always like to start with a similar question in just a different way, because I'm not really interested in your CV or your resume. But when like someone says, "Hey Jay, so who are you?" and you're like, "Yeah, these are the important things that you need to know about me." Like, what's that answer?
Yeah, I'm the son of an immigrant woman who
Okay.
came all on her own and raised me on her own. And so I'm hybridity, right? I am the hybrid of South Korean roots and an American upbringing, and that was a tension for me as a kid, but it's a gift for me as an adult now. I love it, and so that's one thing about me. Two, I'm a husband and a father. I mean, that's kind of the most pertinent daily realities of my life. Being home right now, my two littles are right outside this door. If you hear a little bit of
Bring
ruckus, I
them on.
apologize.
Bring them on. It's
That's
fine.
that's my mic picking it up in the background, and then my wife, who is a high school teacher, and yeah, my best friend. And then thirdly, I would say I serve and lead in a local church. So people call me a pastor. I don't think biblically I do the work of pastoring most of the time. I'm probably more of a teacher and reader of books and regurgitator of ideas. That's probably what I do most of the time professionally. But you know, the technical title, I guess, for most people would be pastor. So I do that, and I love all of those things. So there you go. That's me, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Is hybridity a word? I've never heard that used in a sentence.
You know, the guy who wrote the forward in my book uses that word. He's a pretty smart guy. I think that's where I got it from. He calls it
Scott,
hybridity.
Scott definitely. He made that up. It's fine though, because he's
Yeah,
Scott. He can do that.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know
So
that
it's
I
real now because
yeah, it's in print.
he made it real. Yeah. There you go. Boom.
It's definitely in print. So I wanna pivot to something you just said, although yeah, why not? So you said you wouldn't necessarily call yourself a pastor. Like what do you see as the role of a pastor versus what you do? Like how would you delineate between those two?
Yeah, well, I think what I meant was biblically when we look at first and foremost the word pastor, and two, sort of the functionality of what pastors did, at least in the early church. You know, the word itself implies a sort of shepherding and a relational journeying and almost a fathering of a community of people in a very intimate, tangible way. Certainly, that's a part of my life on relational levels with some people. But I think in the modern evangelical world, when we hear the word pastor, most people are thinking about, uh, you know, at least somewhat charismatic, sometimes not so much, but somewhat charismatic, dynamic sort of personality who stands on a stage that talks and monologues for 35, 40 minutes a week. And they're supposed to inspire us and help us in pragmatic ways and maybe entertain us a little bit and all those things. And some of that is biblical, some of it isn't. Um, but for all intents and purposes, all I mean is I fit into that classic modern evangelical role of pastor. I just don't know that that's like the actual biblical act of pastoring.
Mm,
I do that a little bit sometimes in my life for certain people. Um, but that's not really, I wouldn't call that like my day job, you know,
yeah.
that's all I mean. My day job is all sorts of things that aren't really biblical pastoring.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
important for sure. And I love them and value them and important for the life of the church, but that's all
Yeah.
I meant. Yeah.
No, that's fair. Well, you said it, and I was like, I hadn't really thought about that because for me, pastoring is not necessarily the person that preaches ever. Because a pastor for me is like a pastor for me should, I'm saying this bad. I'm actually not saying it at all. I haven't figured out how to say it badly yet, but I'm going to try. Like someone that's going to come down into the congregation and just ugly cry with you and
Yeah.
say nothing at all while
Yeah.
someone else preaches. If that makes any sense, like preaching
Yep.
versus
Totally.
pastoring. I don't know. I feel like I've said my
Absolutely,
points.
man.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great dichotomy. I'm probably more a preacher than I am a pastor. That's all I
Yeah.
meant, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's your favorite thing to preach on? Like it's a go-to text. Everybody's got like their three things. Like what's the one that you're like, I didn't have time to write this one. Here's where I'm going.
Oh, yeah, dude. Probably anything in Leviticus.
Really?
Just any verse. No, not at all. Kidding me? Get out of here. Yeah, I don't know, man. I love Genesis 1, 2 are always, I do that. I mean, seriously, Genesis 1, 2, I think, frame the rest of the story. And so Genesis 1, 2, Revelation 21, 22. So the bookends I love.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the Gospels, Jesus all the way,
Yeah.
every day.
Yeah.
So if you're asking favorites, there you go.
Yeah. Well, there's at least my pastor, like he's been our pastor now for a little over 5 years. And there's at least a few of the stories that I'm like, I've heard this one before. Let's see how he does
Yeah.
this time. I know where he's going. Let's see. Hey, I like this one. You did it better. There's a little more conviction in this one. And if you're listening, Barrett, I'm sorry, but it's true. You know it's true. He knows it is true. So,
Awesome.
yeah. So you wrote a book called Analog Church, which I do want to. So, elephant in the room. The fact that we can't do things in analog ways because we're recording this at like day 17 of the world exploding because of the coronavirus, which by the time people hear it will not be true. But nothing really is analog anymore. But I don't really know how to ask questions about that. If we get there, we'll get there. But I do want to ask about that a bit. But more so, when you say the word analog church, like what do you actually mean? Because I think people hear that, and like at least when I read the cover before I read anything else, I had a picture in my mind of like high church, like the church that you go to not with your kids, the church that you sit in the uncomfortable pews. So what do you mean when you say analog church?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I think just analog, the word in and of itself, has some elasticity of meaning, but primarily it means tactile, physical, tangible realities. It can mean lots of other things, but it's all based on that sort of baseline. So by analog church, that's essentially what I mean. And more Christian ways to say it might be, what I mean by analog church is embodied, physical, tactile, present, real space, real time church. A church where people actually continue to physically gather, show up, share life with one another in real, again, embodied, tactile, physical, tangible ways. That's primarily what I mean. And yeah, I've heard that several times from people that when they saw the title, they thought the book was about essentially high church, high liturgy, that kind of thing. And it's not about that, but it's definitely not primarily about that specifically.
Yeah.
And I think I'm using the word analog in sort of a broader, more baseline sense. Another way to say it would be like non-digital. I'm talking about a church that is non-digital, which is so interesting because our church, like most churches, have gone totally digital in this COVID-19 reality that we're in. So yeah, by analog church, that's what I mean. Physical, embodied, the Christian theological idea behind it might be the incarnation. I'm talking about an incarnational, in the flesh experience of what it means to be the people of God.
Yeah. So I do want to be real clear. So I have read the book from front to back. So I'll feign ignorance for the remainder of the conversation because those listening have not. So so why I can't see. So here we go. So you're a pastor, minister, priest. I don't care what the word is, in a church, getting paid for a church that most likely has fancy music and all that stuff as well. I didn't Google your church and stream a sermon or any of that, but that's just the way church happens. So what makes someone on a staff with an inherent need for things to work the way that they normally do work to go, you know what, we need to talk about a way to do church differently. Like, how is that? Like, what happens on a Sunday that you're like, you know what, no, I need to write this. Like, kind of how did that happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, yeah, the church where I serve now is I don't know. I guess you would call us a medium-sized church. I don't know. We're if you include kids and babies and everything, all
500,000.
ages. Yeah, we're probably like about 600 people on a
Uh-huh.
Sunday. So that's a pretty big church, in terms of relatively speaking. But we're certainly not like a mega giant whatever. We gather in a 1938 Presbyterian red brick building in a sleepy, eclectic little beach town called Santa Cruz, California. And our building, our sanctuary actually is small. It only seats about 200 people max. That's like shoulder to shoulder. So we gather 3 different times on a Sunday typically. But it feels pretty intimate because there's rarely more than 150 to 175 adults in the room at a time. So that's big, but it's small enough where we can see each other and know each other and get familiar with
Hmm.
one another over time. So that's where I serve now. However, I've been on staff at that church for about 4 years, but before that, I served for several years at um, one of the largest mega churches, multi-site mega churches in town. And it was like total multi-site video venue, the whole thing,
Hmm.
and it was really, and they're a wonderful church. I'm not bashing them, but it was really around that time I served as a teaching pastor there when pretty regularly I was getting up on a big giant stage with big lights and I was preaching to some people in the room, but then I was also looking at this like little camera in the back of the room because I was told that I had to look at the camera because of hundreds of other people that I couldn't see or hear or touch. We're going to meet in other rooms across the city, not even on that day, on the next day, and watch this video of me. So I had to talk into this
Hmm.
camera. And I remember that one experience being really fascinating. I was like, this is strange. Like it felt, on the surface disingenuous a little bit. And 2, I just like, I really struggled to make that connection. And more than anything, I had this deep innate desire to be with those people. Like if I was going to share some thoughts and ideas with them, I felt like, man, I'd love to see their faces and their reactions. And I'd love to talk to them after I'm done talking. And I'd love to stand next to them and sing with them. And I'd love to take the bread and the cup of Eucharist with them. All these things that just kept bubbling up inside of me. So that's really when it started. And when I got to the church where I serve on staff now, yeah, as a church, we've just tried to, again, same word, we've tried to embody some of these things in just small ways. And so that's where the book came from. It wasn't,
Hmm.
again, any sort of like anger or bitterness. It was just questions and things I was feeling inside from my own experience. And then seeing some of that stuff, I think, move in a healthy direction with the church where I'm on staff now. And so, yeah, that's kind of what gave birth to this thing.
Yeah, I have a question about mega churches. So I went to Liberty, which if you go to Liberty and you go to Convocation, from what I've been told, it's like the largest Christian gathering every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday in the
Mm,
Western Hemisphere. I'm not
mm,
sure if that's true, but it's like 11,000 people in one time. So I don't know
wow.
how big churches get. So, but it's not really church either. You show up because they make you, or you can't
Yeah.
graduate, and yeah, so it's compulsory attendance.
Yeah.
So that's everybody really wants to be there. But do you? Yeah, churches can those mega churches don't really, to me, seem like they require much commitment, and they allow people to not have to know people. You're
Yeah.
not elbow to elbow in a 200 seater in a 600 person church.
Yeah.
It's not. So, do you think that churches will continue to trend that way,
Oh,
or
man.
the other, like the opposite, like the no, we really should have like 50-member churches and just deal with it, like, and those are both extremes. I'm well aware of that. Like, just
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
not really related to the book, just genuinely curious because you've been on both ends. Like, in your experience, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, to be honest with you, I don't know. My friend Andy Crouch, he has this, he just recently told me this about 6 months ago. It's really fascinating. He says he thinks that the future of that sort of church, the big, giant, over 10,000 people sort of mega church, um, that they won't go away, but that there will become less and less of them. And and he's sort of prophetic with this stuff usually, but his guess is that, most major cities and urban centers across America right now, a lot of them have like 3 or 4 of these types of churches. He thinks in the future what will happen is most cities and urban centers will have like one. There will be one giant hub of like the 10,000 plus giant spectacle show type thing. But he thinks that they will gather probably a fairly aging community, and that what we will then see as other large churches like that in those towns and cities sort of change and evolve, we'll see not necessarily only like house churches or anything like that. I'm a big fan of churches of all sizes,
Hmm.
but he thinks we'll see more like medium size to smaller size, and maybe even some like sort of big churches, but not the mega, like several of the mega whatever. Um, and I tend to agree with him. One, just because he's really smart, but two, the way he's sort of mapping it out in terms of the trajectory of younger generations. I mean, I think we're seeing that at our church for one, and we're seeing, I live in the Silicon Valley, the epicenter of digital technology, and we're definitely, it feels like we're seeing that especially amongst younger generations even here. So I'm not against large churches. In fact, I actually think the future for large churches won't necessarily to get small. I think it's more about creating warmth rather than trying to be cool. And I think if we can do that, then even in churches that maybe represent thousands of people, you can lean into creating spaces that feel warm and intimate. Some of that does have to do with the size of the room. So it might demand more gatherings than
Hmm.
less, rather
Hmm.
than 4,000 people in one giant room. It might be 400 people in a smaller room 10 times over a weekend or something. So I think we can, I think there's a future for large churches. I hope there is, because I think there's a lot of good that comes from churches of all sizes. So
Yeah.
yeah, those are some thoughts.
Yeah, early on in your book. So I began reading your book while my daughter tried to do gymnastics. She's really struggling for the back handspring. She could do it. She just doesn't know she can do it. But she bounces 19 times after that huge cartwheel. And I'm like, just keep going over.
Yeah.
So in between watching her and reading your book, I highlighted so many different spots, and I kept highlighting a different key word. But early on in your book, you say something. Is it fine if I quote your book back to you?
Please. Yeah,
Yeah. So you
absolutely.
say, since its earliest days, the Christian church has been marked by its invitation to transcendence, not relevance. And relevance makes a lot of sense, especially in today's culture. But what do you mean by transcendence? Because I think people hear that and they're going to go a million different places. The old reptilian part of my brain that was beat into me, I immediately think rapture, but I know that's not what you're saying. So, nor is that what I think now. It's just that's the trigger. That's what happens. So post traumatic stress. So what do you mean when you say transcendence there?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess most simply what I mean is that which transcends the ordinary, normal, mundane, everyday, expected, unsurprising reality of life. So that's a big sort of way to say it, but that is genuinely what I mean. That which transcends the stuff that we expect and the stuff that we know and are familiar with.
Mhm.
And the reason that's important to me is because when we see transcendence against the backdrop of relevance, if you take away the words and you just go based on definition, I thought that that would be a helpful dichotomy, because it's pretty clear to me that in so many of our churches, if you take away the words, um, it seems like by their definition, what so many of us and so many of our churches are trying to do is be relevant. It's one of the reasons why there's entire industry of companies that help your church get into the latest and greatest of like the furthest edges of digital technology,
Yeah.
and the latest and greatest in lighting and sound. And I'm not bashing those things. I think there are tempered, tasteful ways to maybe use some lighting and sound and all of that. And I'm definitely grateful for skilled sound techs who make things sound good. I think that's great. But we churches put so much of an emphasis on that stuff, And I'm just trying to make the point that when we do, just know we're running hard into relevance. We're just trying to look, sound, and feel like everything else. We're trying to keep up with the technological spectacle Joneses, essentially. And when we do that, I think we miss out on the very gift of what it means to be the church, which is the opportunity to create transcendent spaces that don't look, sound, and feel like everything else in everybody's over digitized life, but rather invites people to take a deep breath in a space that feels so other and so unlike everything else. And the way to define that is just to ask, what is everyone's life like? And what is the Christian call to create spaces that aren't like that? So in the digital age, everything is fast and everyone's in a rush. So a transcendent thing is not necessarily to do like magic. It's just, what if we just created space that was slow and that took its time? That's transcendent in the digital age, or yeah. So there you go. I could go on and
Yeah.
on, but
Yeah.
yeah.
So I want to ask a question about that. So, being that many people church hop or they have their own expectations about, and I think you actually use, I don't even remember what page it is, so I didn't write it down, but you use the word church shopping or church hopping
Yeah.
or church something like that. And
Church shopping. Yeah. Yeah.
it's in italics, I think, as well. Anyway, I can't remember it. Page like 872. There's not that many pages in there, but you know what I mean. So I think most people come to church with an expectation of minimal participation, like watching
Yeah.
an NFL game at my couch. Like
Yeah.
I'm going to participate, but I'm going to participate tomorrow when I'm
Yeah.
comfortable participating Monday morning quarterbacking your sermon or
Yes.
the music or whatever.
Yes.
So as a pastor or as someone reading the book, or maybe a pastor reading the book or whatever, how do you do that at a church-wide level without the membership falling apart so the church doesn't sustain? And preparing people to do that, especially because unless you're a church intentionally built to do that, I think the people that are already there or the people coming have a different expectation of what to expect. So how do you pivot a church into that,
Yep.
of making
Yeah.
all that room?
Yeah, that's a great question, Seth. I would, and I think what you said earlier is so important. That how do you do that without essentially ruining your church? Like how do you do that without um, thumping them over the head with the Bible?
Mm-hmm.
And doing it right. It's like all of a sudden they show up and you've just turned the tables on them. They're totally not used to it. So I think that's a great, a really important point. And it gets back to pastoring, what we started the conversation with earlier. To pastor our people well, it doesn't mean that we have to, that we just sort of like the moment we recognize some shortcoming or whatever, we go crazy and just expect people to change overnight.
Mm-hmm.
We have to pastor them. We have to journey with them. So if we are currently serving and leading in churches where really the expectation of our community is to show up and consume a product rather than participating in creating worship together as the family of God, then I think we have to do the hard work of just saying, okay, what is the very next step we could take to take our people in that direction, and then take a step further after that and after that. And there's such a wide variety of ideas there, but for example, like communion to me is one of the most accessible and yet deeply participatory reminders of what it means to be the church. I would argue if you're doing like quarterly communion Sunday or whatever, my opinion is that's not nearly enough.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus leaves us a meal, the bread and the cup by which to remember him. And I cannot fathom why we wouldn't do that, break bread and drink of the cup to remember the risen Christ. I can't, fathom why we wouldn't do that as much as possible every time we gather. And it
Yeah.
is every time we gather. It is by its very nature a communal exercise. So that's one idea. I think a lot of it sometimes, like music is an easy example, because we so in the digital age especially, we are so accustomed to thinking thinking about music as something we consume. So I talk to worship leaders and worship pastors all the time who get so incredibly frustrated because they're like, man, our band practices and we sound so awesome. But then we lead worship on Sunday and the people just have their hands in their pockets and they're kind of humming along and swaying back and forth. And I get the frustration, but I would say two things. One, maybe it's the very fact that your band is so professional that communicates inadvertently that this is music to be consumed, because that's the way most people think about music. And this is like a recent phenomenon, right? We went from 1,000 songs on a little device called the iPod in 2001 to less than, 2 decades later, I could find over 50 million songs on Spotify.
Yeah.
So when we think about music today, most people are thinking music is something I consume. They are not thinking music is something I create. And yet the invitation of the church week after week is to come and create. So if our bands are leaning toward relevance, we're just going to sound like Spotify, all the bands on Spotify or whatever, then no wonder people are like, oh, this is another piece of music I consume, And I'm not saying bands should not practice and be excellent. I absolutely think they should be, because it's distracting if they're not. But I think they've got to do, worship leaders have to do the hard work of, okay, let's sound excellent, but craft and cultivate this space in a way where it's very clear we're inviting participation.
Yeah.
And as a worship leader, I'm not just leading the 6 musicians up here. I'm leading the 200 people out here. Like, I am the worship leader for the entire community, sort of thing. So there you go. I think there's little steps we can take in that direction.
I want to stay on worship for a minute, but I want to say something first. So I actually do lead the worship for our church, and I don't know how big our church is. Maybe 400, 500, 600 members. It really probably, I don't know how many people, 400 or 500 a week come. But I find the weeks that I'm trying to make the music sound good, I don't personally worship. And the weeks that I get the most feedback of people saying, I really, like, that was helpful. Like, I really, yes, today was, because I like when people give me feedback, though I don't usually respond, because my wife will tell you I don't accept praise or criticism well. I just kind of, cool, and I just keep right on rocking and rolling. But the weeks, and this, maybe I'm doing it wrong, but the weeks that I honestly don't care, if like you were in the congregation, I don't care if you worship, but I know that I'm worshiping, those seem to be the weeks that everyone else is also able to worship with me, if that makes any sense. And I'm aware of how selfish that sounds. I know, especially as I say it out loud, but I find if I'm not worshiping, if I'm too worried about the notes, the rhythm, the tempo, oh shoot, we slipped into 3/4, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah. But the weeks that I'm able to actually worship and forget that I'm on a stage are the weeks that everyone else actually also worships as well. At least that's what I've been told. Staying on worship, you talk about whole body participation, and there's a part in here. Where is it? Nope, I can't find it. Yeah. So where is it at? I thought I highlighted it and I didn't. Where is it? Worship as we see it versus, gosh, where did it go? Do you know where I'm at? You don't know where I'm at.
No, I don't have my book in front of me.
Hold on, I'll find it. No, so it's all right. I'm going to pivot away from that because I can't find it. I thought I had it highlighted in the page number written down, and apparently I don't. Instead, I'll go to the other part of that chapter that I want to talk about. So you talked about it a minute ago of you have 90 bajillion songs in Spotify, and worship being something we consume. You talk in here a bit about in the 18th century, Charles Wesley wrote basically all the hymns. And that what it did was it focused the collective gaze of the community downward. And so I like the visual of that, but I'm curious as to how that would break worship.
Oh, yeah. I wasn't trying to make a strong point about that. I think I was in that section of the book. I'm just trying to paint a trajectory of how we got to where we are in terms of, and what's funny is, like, I should have included the Spotify stuff and sort of the ephemeral nature of music previously. I touch on it, but I've done a little more work on it since then. So I'm like a little bummed that, the book's done. So, I'll have to.
You could amend it, I'm sure. Send it in.
Yeah, I'll do an amendment later. Yeah, but I'm just trying to paint a picture. Before hymnals and such, our song choices were limited, right? Because like any song you're having together has to be stuff that's committed to memory.
Mhm.
And then once we got the hymnal, that's when hymnody exploded. Essentially, it's when Charles Wesley just started writing thousands of songs because we could keep them all. We could keep track of them all in this book, you know. And not only do the books have words, the lyrics, the books also had the notes. And most people, the notes are pretty simple to learn once you learn it. So most people, you know, you can say hymn number 426 and everybody could sing it because the notes are there and the words are there and the tempo is there. So if you have like a basic leader, they're not performing, you're not humming along, everyone's just kind of jumping in because you've got it right there in front of you. But also, like, your visually, your gaze is fixed down below at a book, you know, because you're looking at the lyrics and you're reading the notes. And then, you know, when we got to the 20th century, late 20th century, we had the overhead projector, you know,
Mhm.
transparencies. I used to run
Mhm.
those in youth group in the
Yeah.
1990s, and all the
Where the
pressure of
pastor's
like,
kid just switches the thing out and hope you don't get it upside down.
yeah, totally, exactly, man. So, yeah, that fixed our gaze upward, but we also lost something, right? We lost several things, but one of the things we lost is like transparency slides and such, unlike hymnals, don't have notes. So even though we're not looking down at a hymn book anymore, we're all sort of looking up. We can sort of just peripherally see one another. You only see the lyrics. You know, I don't know how to sing that song, and that's been taken further now with, like, you know, Pro Presenter and all those things, which we
Mhm.
use, and it's super helpful.
Mhm.
But you know, the only point I'm trying to make is like, man, we have to be aware of how these technologies are affecting the way we participate or do not participate in worship. So, for example, the very fact that our song lyrics don't have notes to them, and the fact that our people, because we don't use hymns, we don't, most of us don't know even how to read notes because we've never been taught. It's not a value. The only way I can sing the song we're going to sing on Sunday is if you told me about the song beforehand and I listened to it again on
Mhm.
Spotify or
Mhm.
Pandora or whatever.
Mhm.
I have to consume the song, you know, and that we have to be aware, like, that in and of itself is communicating in a subversive way. This is like a song written and recorded by a professional band called Hillsong or Bethel or whatever, you know, and it's really great. And then you have all sorts of other psychological things happening because when you show up to your church on Sunday morning, chances are, no matter how great or awesome the worship leader at your church is, they're not going to sound like the recording you listen to, you know, and the volunteer lead guitar player is not going to shred that solo quite the way the Hillsong dude did it, who does this professionally, you know, and tours the world or whatever. So then you've got to reckon with like what that does to us is, you know, are we consuming or participating? How many times have you heard people say like, oh, the worship was so good today? Which
Mhm.
what they mean is like the music sounded
I
good,
knew the words is what they mean.
or I knew the
I knew the
words.
words. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just a fascinating thing. So yeah, I think that's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah. Yeah. Oddly enough, when I sing music, the ones that I enjoy doing the most are the ones that nobody knows the words to. But
Hmm.
I think it's because it's not on K-Love, and so I don't have to compete with.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, like what really bothers. So there's like a countdown timer sometimes in our church, and I
Uh-huh.
told our pastor this. Like, I'm like, don't play the song that we're about to play right before we play it, because that's disrespectful, that's hateful, it's unrealistic expectations. None of this is okay. None of this is okay.
Totally. Totally.
Um, you touch on the Tower of Babel.
Hmm.
I believe you touch. Yeah, you do touch on
Hmm.
the Tower of
Hmm.
Babel. And there is, again, see, I'm not as prepared as I should be here. Where's it at? Yeah. So you use the word babbling, which I think is this third word we're going to make up today's conversation. I can't remember the third one, but hybridity, but babbling and its effect on community. And I want to find where I highlighted it. Yeah. So you say one of the most dangerous things about our babbling is its propensity to radically lower our expectations of one another. As our interactions are mostly comprised of our showerless articulations, we begin to see others only superficial, as others as only superficial characters. And this in turn has a toxic effect on our understanding of community.
Hmm.
And so I wondered if you could set some context of when you say babbling, what do you mean? And I will say the story at the beginning of that chapter, like I read it a few times and I'm like, every 2 days I do that. Like it's talking about your daughter saying no more email daddy. That's the
Oh
story there
yeah,
at the
man.
beginning of the chat. And I'm like, I do that all the time.
Yeah.
But can you kind of contextually say, like, when you say babbling, like, how does Babel, and by that we're going to talk about the Tower of Babel a bit, like, how does that comprise to a digital analog way that we do church and the way that we do, just the digital age overall?
Yeah, well, yeah, we could talk more about the Tower of Babel story found toward the tail end of that opening section of Genesis 11, which is all sort of one overarching narrative to tell us how the human story went so awry. But, that whole section culminates in the story of the Tower of Babel, where people all over the world, every person essentially, let's build this. And their core idea is we have to build this tower to reach the heavens, to make a name for ourselves so that we are not scattered. And so their fear is to be scattered, right? They don't want to get scattered. And essentially in their pursuit of making a name for themselves, to sort of solidify their place on the planet, God undoes the work, and it says he essentially confuses their languages. And that's sort of the origins of all these different languages, at least in the biblical narrative telling of the world.
Mhm.
And what's fascinating is, God, in undoing sort of their selfish ambition, he basically takes them he scatters them, which was the very thing they were afraid to do, like they were afraid of. And I'm using that story as a parallel for what I think is happening in the digital age. We have these digital technologies that we think, we've been told, are supposed to connect us, create one global village, and make us one, and connect us with everybody, and a deeper sort of connection than we've ever experienced before, and all those sorts of things. And what all of the data is actually showing us is with the rise of the internet, parallel to the rise of the internet, has been a rise in feelings of isolation and anxiety and loneliness and a
Mhm.
sense of isolation. So the very thing we were afraid of, the very thing we thought these tools and technologies were going to create for us, they've turned us into just these babbling sort of people who don't know how to really deeply connect with one another, and that means all sorts of things. And I'm not attacking, particular mediums. Like, I love Twitter. I'm on Twitter all the time, and I get a lot of, I don't know, I get a lot of laughs from Twitter and
Mhm.
some good information from time to time from Twitter. But also, let's be honest, there's a ton of babbling on Twitter, and we have to, like, if I want real depth, I don't go to Twitter. I read a book or have a real
Definitely go to
conversation
Facebook.
with some. Oh yeah, that's right. It's not
See
Twitter, it's
more.
Facebook, right? That's where we go. Or Snapchat, for real depth.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
no, I mean, you get what I'm saying.
yeah.
So I think we find ourselves in really similar situation as way back then.
Yeah, yeah, your story at the beginning, and I'm not going to say the story just because people should buy the book and read the story themselves. For those keeping score, I think it's on like page 90, 86, something like that. Um, but it reminded me of a song from one of my favorite musicians. Maybe it's not a song. I think it's spoken word from Propaganda. You have to know who
Yeah,
Propaganda is. I think
yep,
everybody knows who
yep,
Prop is.
yeah,
He talks about his cheating on his wife with his black wife, but by that he means
yes,
like his iPhone. And I don't know if that's what
yes,
it's called, but I think it's spoken word. And
yep,
just
yeah,
powerful. It's like a powerful 6, 7 minutes there. Um,
yeah.
yeah. So I have a couple questions that I want to end with, but I have another question first. So you have a chapter literally called "How to Read a Book," and so I intentionally skimmed this chapter. But two questions, just because I'm a smart aleck, why would you not begin with a chapter called "How to Read a Book" if you bought a book that you're about to read? And then by that, I'm assuming you mean the Bible. And then, so how do I read a book? But first question first, like, why would you just not begin with that chapter on how to read a book?
Um, I don't know, man. Maybe I should have. I don't have a good answer. No, I wanted to set how to read a book. It is about reading the Bible. It's pretty specific. So I felt like starting with just
That's
the
why I said
digital
smart aleck.
analog. Yeah, yeah. Just the digital analog stuff was important to set the tone first.
Mhm.
And then, I thought worship and community are actually more primarily the things people sort of viscerally feel in their own lives, like digital age is affecting worship and tech and community. I don't think too many people think about how it's affecting the way they read, and particularly the way they read the Bible or don't read the Bible. So I saved that sort of for the end because I thought it was a little bit more niche specific.
Yeah.
But it's actually a funny thing you asked that. It's probably personally the parts of the book, those 2 chapters were the parts of the book that I had the hardest time writing, but enjoyed writing the most. So
why had the hardest time writing? What about that? Because I get you. Like, I agree with a lot of what you say in here. So why had the hardest time writing that? What was so difficult?
yeah, I just hadn't thought about it as much. It actually, the first 2 sections or first 3 sections about discipleship to Jesus in the digital age, and then worship and community. Those are things I long time for several years. But the sections on how to read the Bible and how the digital age is sort of undoing the way we even think about reading and ingesting information, that was much more recent. So I felt like I was like writing on the fly. To be honest, one of those chapters, my editor came back to me. Shout out to my editor, Ethan McCarthy, brilliant man. He came back to me and he's like just cold and brutal. He was like, "Hey man," he put some edits in, and at the end of it, he said, "Hey man, be honest with you, this entire chapter makes no sense. You're gonna have to rewrite the whole thing."
Yeah, and you're
Yeah,
like,
up, here's why. And so I have 2 versions of that chapter because I just had to rewrite the whole thing. But really hard to do, but I enjoyed it. And I think it's important. I think we need to re-engage the way we think about the scripture.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, there's a part in here which literally made me laugh out loud where you're talking about, at the earliest New Testament manuscripts are written in Greek in all caps with no space in between the words and minimal punctuation. And then you literally just have like a sentence yelling at me of, think about reading like that, just like a run-on yelling sentence. I honestly just want to type that on Twitter with no context. Just take that, put it on Twitter, hit send, and be done with it. Just as I might, I'll do it tonight. Why not? So I wanted to ask you a bit about what you said at the beginning. So why Genesis 1 and 2? Like, if I sat down at your church or you came to mine and you're like, here's where I'm going to lean on, I could do this from memory. Like, what am I going to walk away with where I'm like, like what approach do you take to Genesis 1 and 2? Because you could go a lot of ways. Like, we could go young earth creationism. We could go everything's a metaphor. You could go so many different ways. So what's your approach there? I'm genuinely curious because I was expecting you were going to get a Pauline epistle or the Gospel of John or the Patron at the top shelf. But most people don't go with the Genesis.
Yeah. The Genesis is maybe the Jose Cuervo or something. I don't know.
It's a great brand. Yeah.
Man. Well, there are lots of fascinating conversations, like you said, the science conversation and all that, all that stuff. I think for me, Genesis 1 and 2 are almost everything you could trace back to Genesis 1 and 2. There's so much happening throughout what we call the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, and then much more emphatically in the New Testament, there's just all of these callbacks to Genesis 1 and 2 by Jesus himself, and then especially by Paul and others. And that's not an accident, Genesis 1 and 2. I said Genesis 1 and 2 because I believe Genesis 1 2 gives us the picture of what contended for his own glory and for the good of humans, for the flourishing of humankind. And those 2 things are intrinsically linked, which is made clear in Genesis 1 and 2, and then throughout the scriptures in various places. So I think for me, the beauty of Genesis 1, 2 has a lot to do with a good God ordering a disordered world. There's debate about this, but my reading of Genesis 1 and 2, when it tells us that, God creates, he speaks creation into being, the Jewish scholar Everett Fox, he translates the words at the beginning of Genesis 1, not that God creates out of nothing, but that God creates out of wild and waste. And he's trying to capture the poetic language, the poetic linguistic power of the original language in ancient Hebrew, which is like tohu vavohu, which is very poetic sounding. So he translates it wild and waste. So it's not that there's like nothing, it's that everything is disordered. And so the creation narratives for me are not about the Big Bang necessarily. And I'm not saying one thing or another about the Big Bang. I'm not a scientist. What I am saying is, what I think the story is telling us is that a good God creates an ordered, beautiful world out of a disordered, chaotic world. Or you might not even call it a world, a disordered, chaotic unreality. He creates a beautiful, ordered reality.
Yeah.
And the reason Genesis 1-2, based on that reading of it, is so important to me, and my favorite place to preach, I think, is because that's the entire human story. Every moment of the Bible from then, culminating in the resurrection of Christ and the promise of new heaven and new earth, is that same motif. It's a good God creating, ordering, and creating a beautiful reality out of a disordered, chaotic unreality, which is the fallout of sin. Yeah. And we're seeing that even now, and we're feeling it in visceral ways. So
yeah. So I do want to ask, because I would be remiss and I would kick myself if I didn't ask you about coronavirus. So in a church where we're structured around intentionally being in the presence of one another, and I'm aware of how weird that sounds when we're talking a continent away over the internet, but hey, technology is the thing. How does a church, if you've accustomed people to that, so say it's 15 years from now and that's the way the church is, and it's arguably more healthy because we genuinely do life together, and I don't disagree with that at all. How does a pastor come alongside people to prepare for the loss if something like a pandemic ever happens again, or like what's happening now, because there's like a retraction of community, which is depressive. So what word would you say to that? Because I mean, it's happening now, although church doesn't necessarily happen now like that, but some do. So how would you protect against that? Because I think that could be dangerous.
Yeah. Well, I mean, give me a little bit more. Frame the question, because I thought I was tracking with you, but and then you were asking about the dangers.
So so the way that church to me works now is I could show up at any Sunday anywhere. I could participate, quote unquote, and I could leave, and nobody would ever know that I'm there. But if we can reframe things in a more analog way, everyone knows that I'm there because it's such a small body and it's so deeply integrated. And then as I find a church that can plug myself into, that's your family. Like it becomes your family, at least I would hope so. And then something like what's happening with the coronavirus happens and I'm removed from my family. Like I'm quarantined, I'm restricted. I can't commune with them. I can't be with them. I can talk to them on the phone, but we both know that that's not the same because long distance relationships don't work. So as a pastor, if a church is modeled around a more analog style, which isn't really what you write in your book, like how do you protect against the feeling of grief and loss? Or should you even protect against that the people in the church are going to be like, it's been a month and I haven't been with my people. This is church for me. And now I'm no longer getting that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's great. I would not protect against the feeling of grief and loss. I'd actually lean into it. And for us at our church today, and at so many churches of friends who serve and lead at churches in town, there is tremendous grief and loss. And the grief and the loss is painful. But for me, as I think about the future of the church, it's beautifully hopeful. We should be feeling grief and loss. First of all, let me say, in COVID-19 reality, I believe the wise and responsible thing to do, at least in our part of the world where we live now, not just based on government mandates, but the wise and responsible thing to do is of Jesus, driven by a love of neighbor and a seeking of the common good. The wise and responsible thing to do, I think, is to bless the world with our absence and to do the right thing, particularly for the most vulnerable amongst us. And so it's hard and it's a sacrifice. And I have cabin fever. I've only been in my house for 48 hours, but I want to get out. And but that's even, that's small potatoes to what so many others are dealing with when it comes to like the loss of income, jobs. Like this is such a disruption, but it's the right thing to do. But when it comes to analog, I think the grief and the loss is a good thing. It's helping us understand. I mean, think about what's happening, right? Everybody I've actually gotten some messages, Seth, recently from people that I've like debated about the whole digital online church thing. I've actually recently gotten messages in the last few days, and they're good hearted and these are good people who love the Lord. But I've gotten these little jabs at me, on social media, like, hey man, hope the digital online church thing is working well for you, as if they've won some argument.
Yeah.
And, they're friends and I love them and we have disagreements on our ecclesiology. But my point back to them would actually be like, actually, dude, this is, we're on the front end of the conversation. But what I'm seeing is that when we get to the back end of this thing, what's going to be very clear is that the heavy leaning into digital and online realities as church, and I'm using air quotes here for those listening, it's going to be exposed by this strange time that we're in. Because we're just like a couple of weeks into this thing and really a couple of days into the most intense parts of this thing. And already what people intrinsically are feeling is, even though I have my Facebook Live and FaceTime and Instagram and we can Zoom and we're doing all of this, even though we can do all of that, something is missing. Like this isn't quite human in the most beautiful and meaningful, deepest sense.
Yeah.
And so I think we're going to get to the back end of this, and the grief and the feeling of loss, we lean into it and let people know, as those leading and serving in local churches, this is what we have to do for the common good, for love of neighbor right now. But when this is over, when it's wise and responsible to do so, we cannot wait to gather with you again, face to face, as Paul says in 1 Thessalonians. So I think it's a good thing to feel this pain, to be responsible, but to feel this pain and lean into it in a way where when we can gather again, I think there's just going to be this incredible celebration of like, oh my gosh, I took for granted how meaningful and important it is that we're embodied with one another.
Yeah. So I've been asking this question to everyone, and I'm going to try to frame it differently for you because I'm trying to frame it differently for everyone. I find it's a challenge that I've kind of challenged myself to. So why not? So you're getting coffee, and someone that you don't know is like, "Oh, you're a pastor. Tell me about God." And I don't mean the trite response. Like, I mean the one where you're like, yeah, they're like, yeah, don't tell me. I don't want to hear Jesus. You say the word Jesus, I'm going to throw this coffee in your face. Like, so when you say the word God, and I do want to be clear, you can say the word Jesus. It's fine. It's fine. Like, what are you intending to say? Because I'm well aware that they're all metaphors. Like when we're trying to talk about God, like the best that we can come up with is not enough. So when I say the word God or the divine or Yahweh, or whatever you want to say, what are you actually trying to mean?
Well, I'm going to break your rule, man, because for me, it's hard to talk about. Yeah, it's hard to talk about God apart from Jesus for me. Without getting into the details of my own faith journey, I grew up being told a lot about God, and not necessarily even like God the Father, just God. And went through a whole deconstruction process in my faith that so many go through. And what brought me back was the compelling, undeniable story of this, first century Jewish rabbi Neth. So it's hard for me to talk about God without talking about Jesus. So I think my honest answer is that that's probably where I'd go, that as a, you can call me whatever. Like I rarely call myself, I rarely self-identify like as a Christian. Not to say I have a problem with that or to deny that I am a Christian. I am one, but that word has such baggage, particularly today in 2020 in the modern Western world. So what we say a lot at our church is not necessarily like as Christians. We say a lot, not just me, but many of our folks will say as followers of Jesus, and then whatever,
Yeah.
And so it's hard for me to talk about God without talking about Jesus, and I'm not denying the Trinity or anything. I don't want blogs to go up, saying that I'm a heretic or anything like that. God the Father, and Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit, totally. But it's hard for me to talk about any one of those without the other. And
Yeah.
For me, I think Jesus is, Jesus of Nazareth is the one who most compellingly and beautifully sort of into the faith. So, I think my answer would be to break your rule would just be to want to talk about Jesus of Nazareth,
Yeah. Well, it's a
and why
loose
he's
rule.
such a compelling figure. Yeah.
Yeah.
There you
It's
go.
a loose rule, so it's fine. Yeah. Yeah. I'll give a little more context to that in a minute. So point people to the places like your book's like 200 pages. We didn't talk about most of the stuff in there intentionally. I like to hit some of the things that just speak to me because I'm not a huge fan of usually the questions that the publishers put together because
Yeah.
that I feel like those questions are for people that didn't read the book. Yeah, so maybe they're not. And anyway, it doesn't matter. So where would you point people to if they're like, all right, I got to hear this sermon on Genesis, or I want to get a hold of the book, or whatever? Like, where would you send people to?
Yeah, well, for the book, you can just find the book. It's called Analog Church, and you can find that anywhere they sell books. Little boutique online store called Amazon might be a good place, or other
Little
spots.
boutique. It's niche.
And then I have a little website, jkimthinks.com. I'm not saying I'm the only one who thinks. It's just the stuff I'm thinking about.
Just that you are thinking. Yeah.
Yeah.com. And I have stuff up there about our church, teaching stuff, my book stuff, our podcast that I co-host with a friend, Isaac Serrano. So it's all up there. So my website, probably a good place to go.
Perfect. Well, those will be in the show notes. Jay, thanks for coming on. Thanks for your time. I did hear your kids a little bit now and then. I'm gonna leave them in. They'll be guests on the show. But I'm aware of the time commitment, and so thank you to both you, your family, and your wife as well. So appreciate you coming on. I enjoyed it.
Oh, absolutely, Seth. That was fun, man. That was thrilling. I just want you to know it lived up to the billing. I was thrilled an hour ago, and it was thrilling. So seriously,
that's
man,
why you're a professional orator. You brought it all full circle.
So, no, I enjoyed it. I appreciate it so much. Appreciate what you're doing.
Good.
So thanks so much.
Yeah, good. I'll end that there, and then I'll figure out how to end this here. Yeah. So the